I'm going to kind of jump forward to get to the actual discourses, because it's kind of a bit of a tease. I'm going to talk about the four discourses and never actually get to the four discourses. So I'm going to move into the four discourses, where I hope things actually become a little bit more concrete and graspable. But I think some of the slightly more abstract contextual stuff is quite useful for understanding what Lacan is trying to do here. This is from Lacan's graph of desire, which really just is a way of graphically notating the point that I was making earlier, that for Lacan, things are always retroactively positive. So the idea that I know myself before I draw on language to express myself, that I know what I think, what I want, what I desire, before I have the words to put it, which is a kind of common sense, almost psychological way of thinking about things. I have a need, so I find the words that that capture that need, and then I kind of package them together and I send them into the world. Lacan's arguing against this, and he says we actually come to constitute ourselves as subject through language. So we're always positing ourselves backwards through language. So the line from S to S dash would be the chain of signifiers, in our terms, language, and subjectivity is what falls out of language, having been produced through language. Again, that kind of necessary impossible or impossible necessity. And one more thing, okay, I'm going to stop with the one more things, but one more thing before we get to the four discourses. I think it's worth making a quick point about metalanguage. Lacan is famous for saying there is no metalanguage. By metalanguage, he means some language that somehow sits above language, that's able to talk about language without itself being language. Yeah. So the point he's trying to make there is we can't get outside of language. And again, this is where Wittgenstein is very useful for him, because Wittgenstein basically constructs that understanding for us. And Lacan's not entirely critical. He's not hugely critical at all of what Wittgenstein's trying to say. He utilizes Wittgenstein. He sees things in Wittgenstein that aren't conventional to see in Wittgenstein, perhaps, but he's not dismissing Wittgenstein. So he's not building Wittgenstein up to knock him down. So this idea that we are stuck in language, or we can only say sensible things. We can only access a world within a world of language, which we get from Wittgenstein. Lacan's quite on board with. Really what he's doing is he's adding to that. He's adding depth to that, but also noticing gaps in it. He said, so he's very famous for saying there is no meta-language. He actually says in seminar 3, so much earlier in his career, some 14 years earlier than the seminar we're looking at, he says, all language implies a meta-language. It is already a meta-language of its own register. But he then goes on 5 years later to say there is no meta-language. I would argue there's not really the contradiction between these two statements that there seems to be, in the sense that language is already a meta-language, because language is the only thing we have to talk about language. And Wittgenstein makes a very similar point. We're kind of, the only way we can talk about language is through language. There's no other. You can't meaningfully dance a discourse that will tell us anything about language. You can't paint a picture that's going to help us understand language better. The only way we can analyze and understand language or linguistic propositions is through more language. So, and this comes back to the problem that I was trying to get to at the very beginning with social science and discourse work in social science, that you start off with language and then you add more language to the language. All you can do is keep adding more language or more layers of interpretation. There's no possibility of getting outside that, because outside that, nothing meaningful can be said. So all language in that sense implies a meta-language. It is already a meta-language of its own register, but at the same time, there's no meta-language in terms of an outside of that, no language that isn't a language, to put it in kind of completely tautological, contradictory terms. He makes this claim about meta-language again within Seminar 17. So it's an idea that's repeated as many ideas are through his work. He says there's no other meta-language. We move from there being a meta-language to there being no meta-language to there being no other meta-language. This is in the context of talking about Wittgenstein. He says there's no other meta-language than all the forms of knavery, if we thereby designate these curious operations derivable from the fact that man's desire is the other's desire. All acts of bastardry are based on the fact of wishing to be someone's other. I mean someone's big other, in which the figures by which his desire will be captivated or drawn. He's talking here about the philosophers that Wittgenstein is writing against. And this idea of a mastery. So the philosophers who claim to be able to say something about metaphysics, in Lacan's characterization, are simply desiring to be someone else's big other. They're seeking to be the master of someone else, to constrain what is possible, to constrain the thinking that's possible, which Lacan characterizes here as a meta-language, but using meta-language here in the sense of something that claims to be a meta-language, but actually isn't at all. I'm guessing you're probably all familiar with the rings on the boards. Again, we've spoken about some of these ideas before, the idea of what comes before language, or we can think of it in terms of Wittgenstein, the fact of there being something outside language. And I've said that in many ways, Lacan is in agreement with Wittgenstein here, that we are in a trap of language. But Lacan is the first to argue, not the first to argue, in terms of his thinking, he'd be the first to acknowledge that he is not arguing that language is everything. We may be in an ambience of language, we may be in a sea of language, it may be a constraint in the sense that we cannot think of our world without thinking of our world in language. We cannot think of ourselves without thinking of ourselves in language. But language for Lacan cannot encapsulate the totality of our experience. And he argues that there are three modes or fields of experience. We experience the world in terms of the symbolic, the S here, the yellow ring, which is language. It's language and what is implied by language, in the sense that it's language, it's the structure of language, the grammar of language, which is also then to say it's the rules that constrain through language, which is to say it's law. So he's equating language and law with each other. He's parsing them together into this kind of idea of the symbolic. So the symbolic then is what gives us the possibility of understanding the social world. It conditions how we understand the social world, because the symbolic necessarily exists before we exist. So any understanding of the social world we have comes from engagement with the symbolic order. The symbolic order is then also the mechanism through which we can communicate with other people, because the symbolic order is made up of signifiers, and signifiers are what we have in common. So we talk about the possibility of communication, or the successful aspect of language, the fact that we can communicate things between people. This is reliant on the commonality of the symbolic order. If we didn't have the symbolic order in common, then we'd be like, two people from utterly disparate languages trying to talk to each other. We wouldn't have a clue what each other are saying at all. And it's only because we have language in common that we have the first steps towards the possibility of any communication. The next mode of experience he talks about is the imaginary. The imaginary is those points of identification. So the imaginary seems to conjure that idea of images, of pictorial world. That's not quite what Lacan means here. It's not the symbolic world of language versus the pictorial world of images. What he's talking about the imaginary is the point of subjective engagement. So in any language that is utilized, any utterance, there is the material aspect of that language, whether it's written or spoken. So if it's written, the words on the page. If it's spoken, the sound waves that are produced to create certain words in conjunction with other words to create sentences, that material aspect of language, which is what is a reflection of the symbolic order. But there's no meaning in that, because you cannot have meaning in the symbolic order. You can look up the meaning of a word in the dictionary, which just gives you more words. And then you have to look up the meaning of those words in the dictionary, and it gives you more words. And it's endless. You never maybe get back to the starting point if you're lucky, but there's not a point where you get to where the dictionary erupts with a pure meaning. It just gives you words upon words upon words. The fact that we can attach meaning to words speaks to the fact that the symbolic and the imaginary are interlocked with each other, which again is another way of saying the point I made earlier, that meaning isn't in language, meaning is in the people who interact with language. There's an interaction between the subject and language, which creates the possibility of meaning, which is also then to say in any interaction, any linguistic interaction, any communicative interaction, my meaning and your meaning aren't necessarily the same meaning. There's always a gamble there. There's always a minimal gap. And it goes to the question that was raised right back at the beginning. I know what I mean. The problem is that the other person doesn't know what I mean, but the other person never knows what you mean. Or we assume the other person knows what I mean, because that's the gamble we have to take in order to use language. If you're trying to live your life assuming the fact that we all understand English or German or French and have that language in common, but if we wandered around assuming that nobody actually understands the words I'm saying, then I'm in some kind of psychotic bubble. I have to assume that you understand what I'm saying, yet at the same time, I know if I think about it that you don't actually understand what I'm saying. So there's always a risk, a gamble, a gap there. And again, for that gap, is the real as well. The real for Lacan is, put it in very simple terms, the real is that which cannot be expressed. So is that which persists, but it sits outside the boundaries of language, outside the boundaries of communicability. But to say outside then suggests we have language, and somewhere over there we have that which is not in language. The point Lacan wants to make is that these gaps, the gap of the real, is within language itself. So it's the gap between words, the gap between my production of a word and your reception of a word. It's that I'm trying to capture in the words, but always fail. Leon gave some really good examples earlier. The obvious example for me is always the example of why do you love me? I can produce all these words, but the thing that's I always fail to capture in there, I can't quite put into words, is the real. Yeah. So it's the unknown, the unexpressible, the ungraspable in language. So while we have something of the hermetic bubble of Wittgenstein at play in Lacan, Lacan is also adding to it these other dimensions. So language, as language per se, exists as this bubble. And I don't think there's a really big argument between Lacan and Wittgenstein on that ground. But language utilized in the way that we do utilize language as a way of trying to communicate requires people, which requires the imaginary, and it's always inadequate. I use the word, it always fails, and quite rightly, you pointed out that there's a kind of a value judgment being made there in the sense of fail. I think language does fail in the sense we're trying to do something we're unable to do. In that sense, there is an experience of failure. But I think moreover, what language does is it presents as an inadequacy. It's never quite enough to capture what needs to be said. It's never quite enough to capture the world. There's always that of the world which language misses out. If I try and describe the world, I can exhaust myself and exhaust my linguistic knowledge, trying to use all the words that I have to describe something in the world, but there's always going to be something of that thing that I miss out in my description because words simply aren't enough. and this brings us to the real. So that kind of gives you a picture of, more broadly, Lacan's understanding of language before we come to discourse. We need to also remind ourselves that Lacan is a psychoanalyst, and when we're talking about psychoanalysis, we're always somewhere in the room is the unconscious. Yeah, you can't do psychoanalysis without embracing the concept of the unconscious. Psychoanalysis without the unconscious simply isn't psychoanalysis. It's a, it's, I don't know, phenomenology, probably. Which then brings in another dimension to this. So when we talk about language, we have always the manifest level of the language, which is what is heard, what is read, the obvious denotative meanings of words, what we would in psychoanalytic terms call the manifest level. But there's always, inseparable from this, a latent level as well. And in that latent level, I'm not simply talking about the subjective sense of the unconscious, the more Freudian sense of the unconscious, of that kind of like, you know, that thing I already have in me that I bring to bear in the world, which is, I think, how many people would read Freud's talking about the unconscious, that reservoir of repressed memories which constitute some kind of core element of who I am. The latent level for Lacan is about the language itself. So any word that I use when I try and talk to you might have an obvious manifest sense, in sense of a shared sense that we would expect, but it also has that raft of identifications that goes with it, which is going to be different from me as it is from you. So any word I say, if I say, well, I'll give you an example. I gave a talk at a conference in Johannesburg a number of years ago, and my talk was actually on Lacan and discourse, and I was analyzing a narrative account that someone had written about a childhood experience under apartheid, and the story they were telling operated around the core of the story was this experience of the child taking a drink to the child who was white taking a drink to some workers who were black, and they'd use these tin mugs, which were very common in South Africa under apartheid. And I'm not South African. I don't have a huge history of experience in South Africa, but most of the audience, because it's in Johannesburg, were South African. And everyone recognized the tin mugs because they'd all experienced them themselves in their childhood. Tin mugs were big, you know, they had a strong cultural connotation, racial connotation, because you wouldn't give the black gardener your nice china mugs. They would drink out of the tin mugs. So there was the apartheid implication in these mugs themselves. And the quintessential tin mugs, which you'll see in South Africa, you maybe encountered them yourselves elsewhere on your holidays there. They're white, and they tend to have a blue rim around the top, or sometimes there's a green rim around the top. They tend to be tin mugs painted in this white enamel. And the curious thing is, everyone in the audience in the discussion knew these mugs because they'd experienced them themselves. But in the narrative, the person writing the narrative had actually described the mugs quite explicitly as red enamel mugs. And yet this very overt, on the manifest level, designation of the color. Now, we might all imagine a different shade of red, but it's manifest that red was the description which was provided. On the latent level, everyone completely missed this, and everyone leapt immediately to the white enamel mugs that they had experienced in their childhood. My point here is that the words succeed in conveying something, but we can't separate that overt dimension of communicability to what is taken in by the receiver of our communication. In order for the words to have meaning and not just pragmatic sense, the latent level is always there, and the latent level is not going to be the same. So it conjures rather than communicates in that function, but we can't separate the two things. We're getting to the Four Discourses. You'll be either relieved or disappointed to know. So Lacan, on one very simple level, his understanding of discourse, I think, is quite straightforward, quite intuitive. He starts off with what he calls the master. Or we might say simply one person, one interlocutor in a communicative relationship. Drawing on Hegel, we have the master, the slave. So you have the one who speaks and the one who is spoken to. This is the way it's presented in Hegel. This is the way Lacan extrapolates it from Hegel. And this then forms the manifest level. This is the kind of the observable communication which is at play. But to understand the discourse in play, Lacan argues we have to pay attention to the latent level. And he splits the latent level into two parts. He says, in any communicative occurrence, there's not simply the one talking to the other, but there is a truth that motivates that. So we might think of that in the sense of a belief that what is being communicated makes some sense. We might think of this in the sense of the desire that gives rise to the need to communicate in the first place. And Lacan, I've already emphasized the element of desire here, but we need to ask ourselves, why do we talk at all? No, I've already suggested we perhaps produce sounds, words as sounds because of the pure enjoyment of them. But we also, and again, this is what Lacan is drawing from Hegel, we're motivated by a desire. We speak because we need something. A baby wouldn't cry if the baby didn't need anything. A baby who's perfectly happy, who has everything, sleeps or perhaps gurgles and just lies and enjoys itself in its cot. But when we want something, when we have a lack, that's when language comes into play. So we're motivated by this something in order to speak, or put that in a slightly abstract way, speech is always motivated by something. So the position of articulation isn't the starting point. The position of articulation is always underpinned by some latent support. And similarly, it produces something on the other end. So we have the master, we have the slave, we have the truth, we have jouissance. And Lacan, I think there is a conventional version of the Four Discourses, and I'm going to go through a few of them, because if you actually read Seminar 17, Lacan is a little bit unsettled in terms of his terminology. So there is a sense in Seminar 17 where the Four Discourses are very much a work in progress. And I think that's an important thing to grasp. Lacan is not ever trying to present to an audience a fully formed, fixed idea. He's not one of these thinkers who has everything worked out and he's just going to kind of keep going back and repeating the same thing. He's on a journey. He's constantly trying to push thinking, push himself. And as he works out the Four Discourses, he jumps between terms. So at one point, he talks about this fourth quadrant as being jouissance. He also talks about it being production. That could be then the production of jouissance, but it could also be just simply production in itself, not necessarily jouissance. So it's a little bit slippery in terms of the terms he used. One of the crucial things in understanding the Four Discourses is this bar here. So I talk about a revolving door, but Lacan is keen to make the point that it is the truth that underpins the articulation of discourse, whatever sits in the place of this truth. And he's not talking about truth in the sense that Wittgenstein's talking about truth here. He's talking about truth in a subjective sense rather than an external sense, the truth with big capital letters. It is a held truth that underpins the articulation of discourse. Discourse is always the communication or the articulation from one to another. But because, for Lacan, of the persistence of the real, because of the inadequacy of language, because language can never be the final word, it always has a product, it always has an excess. And that's not necessarily a negative. I think it probably isn't a negative. It's that kind of idea that things continue. This is very much the sense of desire in Lacan's work. Without desire, desire may be perceived as a lacking, and therefore as a negative, but really for Lacan, it has that productive function. Without desire, we wouldn't do anything at all. If something was the last word, then being the last word, it would be the end. There would be nothing else to say. So there would be no more language, no more speech, no more desire, no more anything, because we had found the last word. Perhaps that was possible, but it's not very interesting to explore. More conventionally, Lacan describes it here as he moves between these terms. So he starts off with Hegel, but then he moves into this idea of an agent. So the basis of communication, he comes to say, is that we have the agent and we have the other. That's what communication is. I think there's something quite commonsensical about that. I don't think there's a lot to really dispute there. Anything we want to communicate, whether it's communication from an individual or communication from a larger entity, but I mean, a corporation, a government, a university, there's an agent who is the agent of the communication. In order for it to be communication, there has to be another. Even if you're talking to yourself, or maybe slightly better, writing notes to yourself, there is still an agent, another there. Because if you write if you write a to-do list, things you must remember to do tomorrow, you in the present tense is the agent, you in the future tense is the other. So even if it is self-communication in that commonsensical sense, it still breaks down into this simple pattern. There has to be an agent, there has to be another. But as I say, he underpins that with the latent level, the truth, and the production or the product, which then, this is the drawing our attention to the openness here rather than the hermetically sealed, as we would have in Wittgenstein. We have this openness of language in operation. He refers to this as command as well. So again, he is quite variable in the terms he uses. And as I say, he refers to production as jouissance. Sorry, skip that. That's the basis of the Four Discourses. So those, let's go back to it. Those spaces remain the same. Okay, so you have four discourses, but they all operate on this identical template. As he does change the terms a bit, but there's slight variations as he's trying to find the right term. But the space remains the same. So bottom left-hand side is always the position of truth. Top left-hand side is always the position of agent or the position of command, the position from which the discourse is articulated. And then we have the articulation to the other, which is always in the top right-hand side. And then on the bottom right-hand side, the position of jouissance or the product or production. That clearly only gives us one discourse, not four discourses. To give us four discourses, what Lacan does is he puts one of these mathematical symbols into each of the spaces. So I'm emphasizing this because when we move on, I'll only have the mathematical symbols there. But what you've got to keep remembering is the symbol is in a particular place, and that particular place has a particular term or sense attached to it. So the three terms he uses, I won't labor on these because Leon has already done a very good job of explaining them. But these are the four terms he uses: the subject, or better said in Lacan's terms, an S with a bar through it, which we might translate as subject or barred subjects or divided subjects. It has these different connotations we might evoke. S1, which is the master signifier, or it's commonly referred to as the master signifier. But again, Lacan is trying to maintain things here at the level, as far as he can, at the level of these algebraic or mathematical symbols. So if S1 and S2, S2 would usually be understood as the chain of signification. So if we think of language having, and I'll come on to explain master signifier shortly, but we think of language being composed of signifiers. You have all the signifiers, all the words. Lacan argues there's one word which provides coherence to what is being said, and that's the master signifier. All the other words would be the chain of signification. So there's always one word which rises above the other words, or you might say underpins the other words, depending on how you want to spatially represent it. There's one word that stands apart, that gives the coherence to what's being said and allows it, or maybe not allow, that's the wrong word, helps it to be maintained within a certain communicative function, and therefore allows some kind of shared knowledge. Although how that works, I think, is quite variable, as we'll come on to see. Finally, we have A, or Object PTA, and again, Leon has already explained that. In the context of the Four Discourses, we might refer to it as the remainder, or the unthought, or that which cannot be captured in language. So in that sense, it's a representative of the real, or a dimension of the real. Object PTA is a complex term in Lacan, which would take another 4 hours to go through all the different variations and how he uses it, and the sense and the purpose and his use of it. I think in terms of the discourses, we can think of it as that element which escapes signification is maybe a good way of thinking of it. So we have the agent, we have the other, we have the truth, and we have the product, or perhaps slightly better said, we have the truth, we have the agent, we have the other, and we have the product, and we have the impotence of language, which stops the cycle ever going full cycle. So, which is to say, there's never a correlation between the product and the truth. It never comes back together. If it did, as I said, this would be tantamount to having the final word on something, or the final word per se. So possibly it does happen, but we won't be around to find out what happens after it happens, because if it's the final word, there is nothing to follow. So he puts the mathemes into these locations. So we'll start off with S1 as in the position of agent, and this variation of the Four Discourses is what Lacan says is the kind of the starting point. This is the kind of his starting point, our collective starting point, socially the starting point for understanding language, which is to say it's the dominant form of the discourses. So we have 4 forms of discourse, but this one dominates, and this is the one that we always seem to come back to. S1 in the position of agent, S2 in the position of the other, the barred subject in the position of truth, and A, Object PTA, in the position of the product. This is what is referred to as, oh, no, it's not going to say. This is what Lacan calls the master discourse. So he labels each of the 4 discourses: the master discourse, the hysterical discourse, the university discourse, and the analytic discourse, or discourse of the master, discourse of the university, discourse of the hysteric, and discourse of the analyst. What this means for Lacan is we have an authority. There is something, somebody, be that an individual or a representative in the form of an individual, or another entity in society. I'm thinking here discourse on that kind of like social level, who communicates something to someone else. The S2 here is said, would represent the chain of signification, so other language, which is then also to say the bodies of knowledge which exist in the world. Lacan's point here is that we're able to operate in society through discourse because the master discourse exists, which is to say there's a certain solidity provided to us by our reception of language. So there are authorities which contain what is being said. We can think of this, if you think of this politically, if you think of S1 as the authoritarian government who tells us how the world is, tells us how to understand what's going on in the world. The example I like to use is the president of Romania in the 1960s onwards, Nicolae Ceausescu, who was a kind of authoritarian dictatorial leader, the master of the country. And I'm not talking about Ceausescu necessarily here as a flesh and blood individual, so much as the position he occupied. That position, whether he was a puppet or whether he was the mastermind behind it, is completely irrelevant. The point is the position he occupied was used to speak to the people of Romania. And you have the example of Romania, quite a contained people because it was a closed country at that time. So the understanding of Romanian society, this articulation of signifiers, which would capture what was going on in Romania, what it meant to be Romania, what it meant to live in Romania, how Romanian people should understand and articulate their experiences of their country, of their life, of their lives within their country, of their daily interactions, of their society, all of these things that we'd understand as what I would call the world, the world not in terms of the globe, but the world in terms of the world we live in, the immediate world we live in. What the master does here, what Ceausescu or Ceausescu's government is able to do, is to determine that world through the discourses that are produced through the governmental machine, and which largely then are produced, or at least are undersigned by the president. So he becomes a symbol of the government, the metonymic symbol of the government, who produces a discourse which is directed at the knowledge that would be Romania, which would then encompass the Romanian people. That's all well and good as a kind of straightforward description of what might have been going on in 1980s Romania. That you have a dictatorial government which constrains through its articulation, through its use of discourse, constrains what it's possible to do, what it's possible to think, what it's possible to be within the constraint, the physical constraints of the borders of that country. What Lacan's adding to this is necessarily underpinned by a subjective position. Hans Christian Andersen's story, The Emperor's New Clothes, is, I think, quite useful here. In The Emperor's New Clothes, there's an emperor who is conned by this tailor who convinces the emperor that he makes these beautiful clothes that he can wear, and the most beautiful clothes that have ever been worn by anyone, and he looks fantastic in these exquisite clothes. In fact, the emperor's not wearing anything at all. But everyone in the society is told to go along with this narrative, so much so that they all go along the narrative. So everyone, when they see the emperor walking around stark naked, has to behave as if the emperor is wearing these beautiful clothes, and everyone talks about his beautiful clothes, etc., until one small boy points out that the emperor is naked, and then suddenly the illusion evaporates, and everyone says, yeah, you're quite right, he's naked, and the emperor suddenly is hugely embarrassed, and his position becomes untenable at that point. You see a very similar thing going on with the example of Romania, where you have this absolute authority in the position of Nicolae Ceausescu until one point in early December 1989, it might have been late November 1989, when Ceausescu is doing his annual address to the people, and he's talking about agricultural production and how fantastic the country has been in terms of its reaching its goals in terms of production of wheat and et cetera, et cetera. All of which is actually a fiction. It's a discourse. It's a produced fiction. It's not the reality of what's going on. And this is not a new thing in the Romania of the 1980s. He would, every year, he would make these addresses. He'd tell people what was going on, and the version, like the Hans Christian Andersen story, is a fiction, but it's a fiction that people then have to take on board and behave as if this fiction were reality and start to operate, and we might argue even believe is a reality. And Lacan's point is, like in The Emperor's New Clothes, this position is underpinned by subjective belief. We have to believe in it in order for it to work. As soon as we stop believing it, and this is what happened in, I think it was early December 1989, and there are videos, if you look on YouTube, you can see it. He's making this rather boring address to the people, and then this wave of protests start from the back of the crowd. There's a huge crowd assembled in Bucharest to hear him, presumably with very little choice. People are told to go there because they have to go there to create the audience for the president. But this wave of protests, of boos, start to come from the back of the crowd. And if you watch the videos of it, you can see in real time the president's position start to falter. And arguably, it's not from the point he was taken off to the countryside and shot. It's the point, that's the point the presidency ceased to function, because the people no longer believed, no longer underpinned the discourse. People might, on a very manifest level, have already known the discourse was a sham, was fake, but it's the point where that belief is removed that the discourse crumbles. And this is what Lacan's trying to articulate here, that we have the master, but the master is not self-sustaining. The master is necessarily sustained by the subject who props up the master. The master's discourse is directed at the body of knowledge, the people who enact that body of knowledge, the existing conventions, the existing ways of operating, but it's never adequate, which produces a remainder, which it's object A. So what the master dictates, put in simple terms, what the master dictates to the people will have some product. That product might think of is, in terms, again, going back to Hegel, the master talking to the slave is put to work. The work is the excess is produced here, which may produce things for the master, but as Hegel tells us, it also produces things for the slave, and it's through the engagement of the world that the slave is able ultimately to rise to a position of self-consciousness, which is not the intended outcome when the master starts to discourse to the slave. It's the remainder, it's the excess that's produced. Master signifiers. The master in that position Lacan refers to as the master signifier. I always said briefly, master signifier is the signifier, or in terms of, are you comfortable with the term signifier? Yeah. Okay. So the signifier that allows the other signifiers some coherence. There is, the way the term master signifier is often used in Lacanian theory and secondary literature seems to suggest that the master signifiers are somehow inherent. There is something that is already the master signifier. I would argue that that's not really what Lacan's trying to get at here. And he actually makes the point himself in Seminar 17. He says, all signifiers in some sense equivalent, each is able to come to the position of master signifier. And what that tells us is, it goes back to this question of where meaning resides. Does meaning reside on the side of the one who utters, or does it reside on the one who receives the utterance? I'd say it resides in the one who receives the utterance, although the one who utters is also in some sense going to receive the utterance. So you have two elements of meaning here. If you're speaking to multiple people, then there's going to be multiple meanings, which is also then to say there is at least potentially multiple master signifiers. And this is really getting to the kind of some part of the heart of what we're trying to do here. To identify the master signifier in any discourse, the word or phrase that gives coherence to that discourse, allows that discourse to make some sense, that allows that discourse to be understandable, is an act of interpretation. It's not something that's already inherent in the discourse itself. So there's always an active process here. See, I've got an example. If you see here, I would say there's a fairly obvious master signifier here, which is the color red, or just the word red, or red objects seems to be the common point that articulates things. But it's not a necessary master signifier. There are other ways we could understand this. These things all happen to be red, that's pure coincidence, but they're actually all things I happened to see yesterday. And the first 6 things I saw when I walked out of my house. Okay, that's not true. That would be an odd coincidence, but it's possible. Yeah. And the point is that how we add coherence to an utterance, or here, a collection of objects, is something that we impose on it. We impose on it because it gives us meaning. Sometimes it's very obvious. Sometimes it's less obvious. These objects, so these images, have less coherence. I can see a smirk at the back of the room. Someone knows what it is. No? Which kind of makes the point. They're random objects, yeah? We need to do the work of applying a master signifier to give it some coherence. Perhaps you can't find a master signifier that will give it coherence, in which case it's just a random bunch of objects. Perhaps these things all remind you of your grandmother, because she used to send you parcels, and she had an old-fashioned brass kettle, and she kept a cat, and she had a nice garden, and she was always knitting you mittens, and your grandmother is the master signifier here. Or perhaps you're a fan of The Sound of Music, and you remember the song My Favorite Things, and raindrops and roses, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the master signifier you apply to it will depend on the experience that you bring to it, or put another way, the way you receive the discourse in question. And I think that's a really crucial point. The master signifiers don't consist in the language itself. The master signifier is not already there, readily available to give itself up to you. The master signifier is something you read into it. Even if what will appear to you as the master signifier will often be motivated, will often seem obvious because of the way the discourse is constructed. And what that does is it creates the possibility of reading a discourse differently. What it does is drive against this idea that this discourse has this meaning. There is this truth, and I'm not using truth in the sense that Lacan's using it in the discourses. But if we can, or if we have to populate the master discourse ourselves through interaction with the discourse, if we have to populate the master signifier ourselves through our interaction with the discourse, this opens up the discourse. It breaks the discourse open and allows that possibility of multiple interpretations. And my argument, I realize I'm kind of running over time here, without having gone through all the discourses, and I actually thought I was going to have too much time. I've ended up with too little. This is the point I think that Lacan brings, or Lacan's Four Discourses bring to the social sciences. It provides us with an impartial, impersonal mechanism through which we can analyze discourse in such a way is that we escape the trap of an immediate identification with the discourse, and therefore a leap towards an assumption in terms of what the discourse is about. We still using Lacan as a way of analyzing discourse need to do the work of analysis. But what we often find when we try and interpret something is we interpret through our identification with the text. So we think we understand what something means. And what Lacan allows us to do is to take a step back from that and almost force us into a position, or not almost, forces us into a position where we have to think other than the way we would most immediately think. And that provides us not with a solution to this problem of repetition versus invention, but something of a safety net against it. So it allows us or forces us, pushes our hand into producing multiple interpretations rather than singular interpretations, and multiple interpretations which are necessarily distinct from each other rather than multiple interpretations which are variations on the same interpretation, because we have that inclination to interpret things in the way that we most immediately see the interpretation working, which is to say the way in which we identify with the text. So very, very quickly, and I will try and do this very quickly because I think we've got the core here. You have the master discourse, which is the master signifier, or the position of master in this position of articulation, which gives a solidity to discourse, but also then constrains the discourse in question, but is always, as I say, underpinned by that subjective engagement. And Lacan argues that the discourses rotate. And this is the thing, it's not a case of choosing one discourse over another discourse, because the discourses are always in movement. So the discourses can rotate through 180 degrees, giving us, if we put the subject in the position of agency, we have what Lacan calls the discourse of the hysteric. And the hysteric for Lacan is the neurotic structure, which is always questioning. So we put the hysteric here, we have a questioning of the master signifier, we have a questioning of authority, we have a questioning of received understanding, motivated by a gap, a lack. Yeah, the subject questions because it doesn't know the answer, whereas the master always knows the answer. The subject doesn't know the answer, and that's precisely what motivates them to question. And what that does, Lacan argues, is produce new knowledge. So again, it has this productive dimension. It produces new knowledge. On the less productive side, that's slightly the wrong way of putting it, it's endless. Yeah, the subject's questioning doesn't produce an answer. It produces more questions, more knowledge, more possibilities. If we pull it back in the other direction, so we're back to the master's discourse, we rotate the other way, we have what Lacan calls the discourse of the university, or I would argue, maybe slightly better said, it would be the discourse of knowledge or science even. Here you have in the position of the agent, the body of knowledge itself. So he's talking about universities, he's not really talking about institutions, or necessarily talking about institutions like this one. He's talking about this idea of essentially what universities do. Universities package knowledge. They produce ways of thinking about the world, received ways of thinking about the world. So the discourse of the university is where knowledge becomes it. Science is perhaps the best example we have in our current society for that, where science produces answers. Science is underpinned, or the university, the knowledge in question is underpinned by whatever grounds it. It's going to be different for different discourses. If we're talking about religion in this position, the knowledge body of religion is underpinned by an idea of God. If we remove that, the knowledge crumbles. Science is underpinned by a base idea of empiricism. So something very close to what we're looking at when we're talking about Wittgenstein. You take that away, you start to question that empirical foundation that knowledge can be produced through observation and repetition, then the function of science starts to disappear. Again, a very good example for understanding our contemporary world, where science, I don't know how it was in Germany, I presume very similar, but certainly in the UK, science over the last 2 years has been elevated to this unquestionable position where there's this body of knowledge, which is underpinned by very little other than this instruction from the master to follow the science, we can't then question it. What this for Lacan produces, what the university discourse produces, is the divided subject, because the answers that are produced, the discourses produced, is precisely what divides the subject, keeps the subject looking for new answers, and brings us back to the discourse of the hysteric. And finally, the last discourse he gives us is the discourse of the analyst, which I would argue really talks, this is where Lacan comes back to the analytic clinic and is talking about the analytic clinic. And in some ways, within that way of understanding what Lacan's doing in Seminar 17 is really the ultimate point of what he's trying to get to, is how the analyst functions discursively with the analyst, and where the analyst is in the position of the empty position. The analyst in Lacanian psychoanalysis and practice is supposed to disappear themselves, to remove themselves as much as possible. But their silence is what speaks to the subject. And what does it produce? A new master signifier. This is the aim of analysis. I've gone on far too long, so I'm just going to skip very quickly, and you can have my slides. You can fill yourselves in these bits yourself. Just to bring back to kind of one final point, which is the ethics of this. And I think for Lacan, there's always an ethics. Lacan conducted his 7th seminar on ethics, explicitly the ethics of psychoanalysis, but I would argue every single one of Lacan's seminars is a seminar on ethics. And this comes back to this kind of fundamental point about what's going on in terms of discourse analysis from a Lacanian perspective, is it comes back to the interpretation. But it comes back, and this is in Lacan's own words, there is no universal discourse. There's no point of closure in a discourse. It's precisely by starting from there that you, as in the one who receives the discourse, are responsible for the discourse, responsible for how you interpret the discourse. And that's the kind of ethical imperative here, that as we analyze discourse, the meaning isn't in the discourse. The meaning isn't readily available. It's not just sitting there waiting to be found. It's an active production. And it's not an active production if we use Lacan's Four Discourses. It's an active production anyway. What Lacan's Four Discourses allow us to do, say, is this artificial mechanism, this tool that we can place between ourselves and the discourse, which allows us to analyze the discourse in a way that doesn't just slip back into a readily received interpretation of the discourse, but forces us out of that, but all the time putting us in that place, in that driving seat where we are responsible for the interpretation that we produce. And I will stop there, having talked far too much.